Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming out on this gloomy, slightly cold and rainy day. It's thankfully not as cold as I was afraid it was going to be. We're going to talk this morning a little bit about the birds of Florida, but we're going to go even beyond the birds of Florida. We're going to talk about Florida's natural history, and we're going to talk about some of the other animals that you might find all across the state, not just down here in South Florida. But before we do that, I'm going to take you back a few years to kind of how I got into this to begin with. So I was actually born in Seattle, and my early childhood was spent hiking in the mountains, going to the tide pools, really getting excited about any kind of wildlife that we encountered, and really learning to respect and appreciate nature of all levels, everything. Geology, climate, it didn't matter. My parents were into it, and they were infusing that into us as well. But at the age of 8, we moved to Manila in the Philippines. And at the time, it was the second largest and most polluted city in the world. This picture is actually from last year, and I can tell you it actually looks a lot cleaner than it did when I lived there. But still very, very congested, a little more green space. But, you know, as you might imagine, not a whole lot of nature. And those two shots at the top are exactly where I lived. That's now. It looks a little bit different than it did when I lived there. But again, not a lot of green, not a lot of nature. And we spent a whole year living like that, and I thought I was going to die. And then finally we started commuting out into the provinces of Cavite. And this was a couple-hour bus ride, and we did this twice a week, one way in, one way out, one way in, one way out. And during that time, I got to physically watch Manila grow and turn all of those beautiful rice fields and coastal villages into concrete. And by the time we left, it was already very nearly part of the city. And when I went back this last year to visit after 30 years, I was appalled to see that it really truly is part of the city. And even the little patches of forest and the mango orchards that were part of that property, you know, they're pretty sparse now. It's all housing. So it was there that my kind of conservation ethic was developed. So when it came time to choosing a career path, I thought, well, obviously I have to work in nature. So I decided to become a herpetologist. And that's actually what brought me to Florida. I went to graduate school at Florida International University in Miami, and I studied strawberry poison dart frogs. Now it's actually a really incredible system. You can see how small they are with that little red dot on my arm. I know it's a terrible picture. I was not a photographer back then, and clearly not, but my friend wasn't either. But years later, I've gone back and taken pictures, and part of what's so cool about them is they are the most variable vertebrate in the world. So all of those crazy color forms, they're all the strawberry poison dart frog. The classic one is red body, blue legs, but as you can see, they're quite diverse. And they have a really complicated natural history, with the moms laying eggs in the leaf litter. The dad takes care of those eggs until they hatch. And then the mom comes back and she collects the tadpoles. And if you see the one on the end, if you look at the base of her back, you can actually see one of those tadpoles. She carries them up into the trees and she puts them inside little pools of water in bromeliads. She communicates with them with tail slaps, ripples in the water, to know that these are in fact her tadpoles, and she feeds them for several weeks until they become little froglets. So very, very highly complicated system for this tiny little frog, right? And then at the same time, that's actually what I got my master's degree on, but at the same time I was helping one of my professors from undergraduate working on endangered endemic iguanas in the Bahamas and looking at the nesting ecology of these lizards. So through all of that, I was loving the field work. I thought it was fantastic to spend so much time out in nature. I mean, I got to camp on an island, an uninhabited island in the Bahamas 2 summers in a row. I mean, I was like, this is heaven. But when it came time to decide, am I going to do a PhD or not, I was like, I don't really like the data part of this, and science writing is just so boring. I don't really know if that's what I want to do. So for me personally, I decided I was going to go travel and maybe get some inspiration. And it ended up being 3 years of traveling all around New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia. I taught English in China for a while. I worked on a sailboat in the Bahamas for a while, all kind of hoping I'll figure it out. And fortunately, inspiration did come, and what it came in was a form of a camera. I was given my first ever camera from friends in Miami before I left. And it was a tiny little point and shoot, and I quickly had to upgrade it. But what I realized with that camera is I was looking at the world in a different way. I was looking at nature in a different way. And I realized photography was a visual storytelling tool. And I had always loved writing, so I thought, well, what if I combine these two and write about and tell stories about the thing I love most, which is nature and conservation. So these two books were the first, my official transition from being a full-time biologist to being a full-time writer and photographer. And these are obviously both about nature. The bottom book is a coffee table book on the birds of Fairchild, and that's for Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden in Miami. And it's all about the role public gardens can play in bird conservation. The one above it is a practical reference for how to garden for wildlife in South Florida, because, as you might imagine, it's very different than the rest of North America. And at the time, there were no resources for South Florida. And so I decided that this was going to be one of my conservation contributions for the area. And these two books led to many others, and specifically the Attracting Birds book opened doors for other University of Florida Press books, because I continue to give talks on how to garden for wildlife in South Florida, and I was at a Native Plant Society conference where I ran into the editor who had acquired that book, and she says, you know, we would really love to do another book on your photography. Would you be willing to do that? And I was like, well, yeah, I'd love to do that. And she said, great, pitch me an idea. I was like, okay, excellent. And as she's walking away, she turns back and she goes, oh, but no birds. I just acquired a bird book. Well, as you might imagine, I had just spent the last several years perfecting my bird photography. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to figure this one out. So fortunately, I came up with an idea that did let me sneak a few more birds in there. But this book, I decided as I started looking at the literature, I realized there was no good, comprehensive book on Florida's wildlife, particularly not one that was paired with good photography, and really told the state's natural history in an accessible way. Right? There were some textbooks that even I, as a biologist, was trying to fall asleep as I was reading. I mean, I didn't mean to, but it just kind of happened. And I was like, this is no good. You know, we need people to understand our nature and our natural history in order to love it. So I decided that was going to be the project that I was going to do. Now, it turns out that I had always been really opportunistic about my mammal photography, which I hadn't fully appreciated when I pitched this idea. But suddenly, I had a target list that included things like the Florida bear, the Florida panther, and foxes, and things that are up all night. And I don't use camera traps, and I don't use flash, so I had to develop a new method, which I started to refer to as my Zen photography. Because I would research where the animals are, I would go there a couple hours before sunrise, I would park, I'd lower all my windows, and then I would just sit. And when I mean just sit, I literally mean just sit, okay? Because I couldn't listen to music because I might miss hearing something. Obviously I couldn't be talking on the phone because I'd be making noise and scare off the animals. And I couldn't even just kind of be browsing a magazine, because some of these things, they come and they go quickly, and you cannot imagine how quiet a very large bear can be. You don't even know they're there if you're not paying attention. So, mosquitoes, cold, hot, I just had to sit there and be patient and be ready if something happened. So I spent way too many hours doing that, but also hiking around. And the pandemic ended up working in my favor, because as you may recall, there was a stay-at-home order. Everybody had to stay home for the first month. And as you may also recall, and I'm sure this happened at Ding Darling as well, the wildlife began reclaiming public spaces in these natural reserves. And that happened at Fakahatchee Strand Preserve, which is a spot that I had identified as really good for panthers. And so that very first morning they lifted the order, I went out really early, and I tell you, it was very dark actually, and I found a mother panther and her 3 cubs. One of them has just gone into the bushes there, which is why she's looking off. And they were just walking down the road as if they owned it. And I knew I was the first of many people who were about to come and take back what they had just recently reclaimed, and I didn't have the heart to get any closer. So I just sat way back. And because it was so dark, and because they were so far away, it almost has this dreamlike feel, which I actually am okay with, because I feel like it felt like a dream while I was there watching this. I mean, what are the chances of just driving up on a family of panthers like that? So that ended up working in my favor. And the pandemic ended up working in my favor for another reason. Just before COVID hit, I had helped form a birding group in Miami called Phoebe's Birding. And it was really aimed at people who didn't know anything about birds. And the ultimate goal was to create a community of women that love nature in a city that's not very prone to nature, right? So we wanted a place where we could really just bond over nature and using birds as a tool. And it was highly successful. We were getting 30 or 40 people on our walks before the pandemic hit. This was a group that gathered to go camping in Long Pine Key in the Everglades. So this was a pretty dedicated crew. And we ended up getting some national press right before COVID hit. So when COVID hit, and the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matters blew up, we suddenly got an email in our general information box from an editor out of London, from Bloomsbury, which is a very, very respected natural history publisher, basically saying, do you know anybody who's not an old white male who can do a Birds of Florida book for me? And I was like, yes, I can do it. And when I first started talking to him, he said, just what the average visitor would see in a couple of weeks. And, I'd seen a lot of Birds of Florida books that had 100, 150 species, so I assumed that's what he was talking about. So that's, the most common birds, and I'm thinking, I've already got most of that. I'm already traveling around the state for my my Wild Florida book, so I'm sure this will be an easy addition. So yeah, I do have this. Well, turns out they were a little bit more complicated than that. When he was saying the most common birds, he actually wanted over 300 species of birds, which is considerably more than just the most common birds. That includes some, rarities and migrants that are only here briefly, so it became a much bigger project. The other thing is, it turns out the photography was not compatible with my Wild Florida photography, partly because I had to be really specific when I was looking for these birds, right? I had to go exactly the one spot where that bird was. But also the style of photography was very different. I was trying to be artistic in my Wild Florida photography, but for the Birds of Florida book, I just needed bird, front, center, close. It was really all about trying to show the identifying features, like what color are the legs, what color is the rump, like are there wing bars, right? So it just needed to be very close up, centered on the bird. So they ended up not being compatible. So I finished up my Wild Florida book, and then I spent the next 2 years out taking pictures for this book. But because this book had come through the Phoebes, I really wanted to make it a book that even people who had never birded before could use. And one of the things I had learned through hanging out with the Phoebes was that one of the most intimidating things is some of the technical terminology. So maybe the most accurate description is to talk about the superciliary line, but if you don't know what the superciliary line is, it doesn't help, right? So I decided I was going to avoid technical terminology as much as I could and really focus on, in layman's terms, what is it about this specific bird that makes it different than any other bird? So that was one goal of mine while I was working this project. The other thing is, I really wanted this to be a Florida book, a truly Florida book, because some of these, you see them, and there's one that goes for all the nation, right? And you look at the pictures in every book, whether it's Michigan or California or Florida, it's all the same picture. And I was like, but our birds here are different, they have different eye colors, they have different plumage. So I wanted to make sure this reflected it, not just in the way you see birds here, but also in the fact that we have some subspecies, like the prairie warbler you see down there in the lower corner, that only occur in Florida. And I wanted to make sure that was included in my book. And then, of course, it also was very important to me that you have both the male and the female, because, as you can see here, they can be very different. And a lot of guidebooks only show you the beautiful males. But how would you ever know that you were looking at the female if you didn't see a picture of it? And the other thing is breeding plumage versus non-breeding plumage. Birds can look very different when they're trying to attract a mate, right? They get all dressed up just like we do, and they look different. And the fact is, a lot of bird books like to show the pretty ones, but guess what? Most of the birds we have in Florida are in non-breeding plumage. And so I wanted to make sure I was showing the birds in the book as they are seen in Florida, because it can be very confusing otherwise. But the biggest challenge really was that early on I decided, in that first conversation, right, I'm going to take all the pictures for this book. Of course I am. But normally if you go to a photo garden and you look at the back, there's a huge line of credits for all the photographers. And once I realized it was 300 something species, I gave myself peace of mind. Okay, if I have to, I'll use other people's photos. No problem. But the closer I got to meeting my goal, the more I was like, oh, hell no. These are going to be my photographs, every single one of them. I'm going to do this. And my husband's an ornithologist. Fortunately, he did not tell me until I had already submitted all the materials, but he said, you do know that, photographing over 300 species, including males, females, breeding, non-breeding, that was an impossible task. In 2 years, yeah, that was impossible. I'm like, well, I'm glad I didn't know it was impossible, because guess what? I did it. And of course, there were some trials and tribulations along the way. This was in the Panhandle, and I met my first ever Blackwater River. And despite the fact that both the map and my GPS said, yeah, it's a road, go ahead, go on through. Well, it turns out Blackwater rivers never really dry down. And this was, I tried digging myself out, ended up covered in mud with my Jeep even deeper in the mud. So I finally was like, okay, I'm gonna have to call somebody to get me out of here. So I started calling tow companies in the area, and each of them went, you're where? Oh, yeah, no, we don't go there. We'll get stuck. And by the time I talked to the last one on the list, I was on the verge of tears. I was like, okay, but what do I do? I'm stuck here. And the guy took pity on me. He must have been able to hear the tears in my voice, because he said, well, call the county sheriff's office. And I was very wary, I will confess, because I was like, great, and now I'm going to be stuck here, and I'm going to get a ticket for, destroying a natural area. Like, this is wonderful. But I called, and the receptionist was really kind. You're where? Yep, okay, we'll be there. And within half an hour, a whole bunch of pickup trucks arrive, and all these burly guys get out, and they start winching my Jeep out. And I keep saying, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. And finally, the one female cop comes over to me, and she goes, honey, you do not need to apologize. You just made their day. They're saving the damsel in distress. You are good. I was like, okay, cool. I feel better now, thank you. But what made me be able to get through all of the times when I wasn't finding the birds, or I was, stuck in the mud, or any number of other things, there were lots of days where I was like, oh, I'm never gonna achieve this. This was crazy, what was I thinking? Was the times when it would all come together, and all that effort paid off, and the stars would align, and it was perfect. And this Kentucky warbler was a good example. It was my very last spring migration before my Birds of Florida book was due. And I had a handful of species that I still needed, migrants that would only be in the state for a few days. And I brought one of my Phoebe friends down to Key West, and we'd spent all morning at Fort Zachary Taylor, which is a really good migratory spot. And I was like, okay, we have to get these birds. And we maybe got one of them, but we didn't have all of them, and we certainly didn't have the Kentucky warbler, but we had birded that place to death. We were like, okay, we're just gonna have to go. We give up, we go to a new spot. So we get in the car, we're backing up, and all of a sudden my friend slams on the brake, and she's like, Kentucky warbler. And literally it landed on the twig right in front of our car. I still have my camera in my lap. I jumped out, I took the picture, the bird flew away. It wasn't on anybody else's eBird list, so we were the only ones that saw it. And I was like, whew, yeah, we can do this, yeah. So it was moments like that that kept me going. But what I want to do now is share with you a little bit of what I learned about Florida while I was doing all of this. And I think the biggest take-home message is Florida is vastly underappreciated. People think, oh yeah, we're beaches, we're palm trees, we have some big birds, but that's what they think of when they think of Florida. But believe it or not, we are one of the most biodiverse states in the nation, right? And if you look at that map, each of those red spots is what's known as a biodiversity hotspot. What that means is there's a super high number of species in a relatively small geographic area. And these are not biodiversity hotspots just for Florida. This is for all of North America. And each of these is slightly different. So in the Panhandle, this is what's known as a temperate biodiversity hotspot. And so this section of Florida has been part of temperate North America for as long as there was North America. So at times when the rest of Florida was under sea level, this was still actively part of temperate North America. And even today, there is a direct connection to the temperate zone through the Apalachicola River, which runs down from the Appalachian Mountains. So we still have a direct connection to the Panhandle, to the rest of North America. And so it's not an accident that the global biodiversity hotspot for salamanders for the whole world is the Appalachian Mountains. And guess what? Nearly all of Florida's salamanders occur only in the Panhandle. Ironically, some of North America's most common backyard birds were the ones that were the absolute hardest for me to photograph, because they only up in the temperate zone, right? I've only seen robins in Miami, where I live, 3 times in over 20 years, okay? They don't get down there. They don't get down here that often. It has to be a really horrible winter. So maybe this year. Maybe I'll have robins this year. So for these, I had to go up to the Panhandle in order to get some of the most common North American birds. And I can tell you, my friends in Miami did not believe me when I said, I'm going to go take pictures of beavers in Florida. And they were all like, wait, we have beavers in Florida? What are you talking about? And I was like, well, yeah, up in the Panhandle. And sure enough, when I got to the Panhandle, I was literally given directions. Turn right at the beaver dam. And this was close to where my Jeep got stuck. And I was like, are you kidding me? How am I going to find this beaver dam? Like, what are you talking about? But I got to the road, and you couldn't miss this beaver dam. That wall there was the height of my Jeep window. And it went on for a couple miles. And it turns out it was just one of many beaver dams. So these were multi-generational beaver dams and lodges that have been there for many, many, many years. And everybody locally knows where they are. So you give directions. That's a beaver dam, of course. So for us, that's kind of unusual down here. You don't think of beavers as being a Florida animal, and sure enough, they've never been down in South Florida, but they have always been a part of life in North Florida. Now, when you get into the central part of the state, those are what are known as the Central Florida Highlands. And this is an area that for a long time was an island in its own right, because there was sea all around it. The Panhandle was part of temperate North America, and this was the only part of Florida that was out of the water. So those are ancient dunes, and the basis for those habitats that are there are sand. And so we have very uniquely Florida habitats, known as Florida scrub and our dry prairie, that are both sand-based, and they occur where you see those red spots in the middle. And it was separated for a long time such that those habitats occur nowhere else in the world. And they host species that occur nowhere else in the world. And in fact, Florida is also the state that has the most number of endemic species in the nation. And that's largely because of these Central Florida Highlands, where there's animals that occur nowhere else, including our only endemic bird. This bird occurs nowhere but Florida. This is the Florida scrub jay, and it is confined to those particular habitats. Those particular habitats also host the Florida sand skink. And I know you're looking at it thinking, gosh, it looks like a snake. It's not. It's actually a lizard. It has tiny, tiny little legs, but it has these little grooves across its body that those little legs can fit into. And they actually have little clear lids that come down their eyes, and they literally swim through the sand. So highly adapted to this type of habitat. And you may have heard of the black widow spider. Well, this is the red widow spider, and it is another species that only occurs in Florida scrub. Now, this is a species that I will confess I had never heard of before I started working on the Wild Florida book. And when I heard about it, I looked it up and I went, oh my gosh, that's spectacular, it's so pretty. Of course I have to have it in my book. So I started digging through the scientific literature, and everything said you have to go out in February on a cold, foggy morning, and you look for dew on the spider webs, and you're going to find a maze of spider webs all over the palmettos. And then you look for a little funnel, and then maybe if you're very, very lucky, there will be a spider in there. Well, it was July. I was on the coast. My book deadline was November, so there's no way I had another February to do this. But I thought, well, it's at least overcast this morning, and there was a little patch of, scrub on the coast next to me, so I thought, well, I don't have anything to lose, let's just go try. So I started walking around, and there was no dew, but I started to get the search image, and I can see, wow, there's an awful lot of spider webs over there. Not on the palmettos, but on the oaks. So I started getting closer and looking, and I was like, oh, wow, I think I see a funnel. So I got really close, and wow, there's a little egg case, so maybe somebody's actually living here. And all of a sudden, a mom red widow spider, and they're quite large, came tearing out at me, and I jumped backwards. I was so startled, first of all, to find one. And then, also in the back of my head, I'm like, well, it is related to the black widow spider. It does have venom. But then I had to calm down and say, okay, but like most spiders, their mouthpieces are not designed to bite us. You really have to be messing with them and holding them in order to get bit. So then I was like, no big deal, we're good. But it ended up being an amazing morning. I ended up finding a whole bunch of these, which I've talked to entomologists, and they were all like, that's remarkable, I can't believe that happened. So do your research, learn what you can, but still have hope, don't give up, try. And the other thing, the reason this is the picture I ended up putting in the book was partly because what it's eating there is a palmetto scarab beetle that is also endemic to that habitat and is probably the primary food source for the spider. Now, by the time you get down to where I live, we have what's called a tropical biodiversity hotspot. And it makes sense because we're in the warm waters of the Caribbean. We're actually closer to the Bahamas than we are to Tallahassee. We share the climate, we share geography, we share a lot of the plants, and of course then we also share some of the animals. And so most of our tropical animals have come through the air, like the white-crowned pigeon, or over sea, like the ligulous snail. Now, if you're clever, you're looking at that and saying, but that's a tree snail. Why would it be in the water? And that's a very good point. But its distribution is only in Cuba and in South Florida. They've done research on these guys, and when they're estivating or hibernating, they get so locked onto the wood that it becomes watertight. And so they can actually survive in the ocean if they're attached to a log. And so the theory is that there was probably a big storm event, probably a hurricane that came through and blew these guys on logs from Cuba into South Florida to establish another population. Now this is North America's rarest bat and Florida's largest bat. It's actually another endemic species, but it's from a tropical genus that you can find all across the Caribbean. Now, this is a species that I was getting towards the end of my book, and I was starting to get cocky because I'd gotten so many species that were on my list, and I was like, cool, maybe I should aim high, like really high, like for this rare and endangered bat. And I knew that Zoo Miami and Bat Conservation International, they had been doing acoustic surveys through Miami, and they had learned that there's more there than anybody thought. Even within the city, there are Florida bonneted bats, and one of the conservation dilemmas for them is that they live in people's roofs. So when people go to change out their roof, they can wipe out an entire colony of bats. And so they thought, well, maybe one of our conservation contributions, now that we know this, is we can put bat houses up for them. And so they have. And, other places they tried to do that in Central Florida, and they never worked. Well, these instantaneously got filled. And so I'd heard that they'd been really successful, so I reached out to Dr. Frank Ridgely, who was in charge of the program at the zoo, and I said, hey, would it be possible for me to come photograph your bats for this project? And he said, well, I'd love to help you out, but I don't really care how good your equipment is. These bat houses are really high, they're really dark, you're just not gonna get any photos. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's a bummer. The next morning I woke up and I had an email with all caps in the subject line, you must have good karma. And I read on and it said, come to the zoo. And I was like, okay. So I immediately went to the zoo, and it turns out that this little guy was living in a picnic pavilion in the park right next to the zoo, which is all pineland. And so it turns out he was there because right across the water was one of their bat houses. Now, these guys live in harems. So one guy taking care of a whole lot of ladies. And this young male was thinking, maybe he's not doing a good job. Maybe not all of his ladies are very happy. And it turns out that was the case, because you know, the zoo felt bad that this endangered species was slumming it in a picnic pavilion, so they gave him his very own bat house, and he immediately moved in, and within a matter of weeks, he had populated with some of the ladies from across the way. So, good on him. But one of the other things that's really cool about Florida is we have crocodiles. We're the only place in the continental United States that has crocodiles, and the only place where both crocodiles and alligators occur. So I want to give you an example of the writing from Wild Florida, because again, my goal was to make it feel more like a walk in the woods with me rather than a textbook. So I'm going to read this to you, but I wanted to give you a visual of what it's like to do field work on crocodiles in Florida Bay in the summer, and I hope that outfit kind of gives you an idea of how many mosquitoes there were. Yeah, lots of blood donated to Everglades National Park. All right, so, and each of these animal essays, there's over 100 of them, and then in addition I have some sort of larger thematic natural history essays on, you know, what does it mean to be native, what does it mean to be non-native, but for the animal species essays, I've got a picture, in this case that one, paired with text, and I'll read you part of that text for the American crocodile. Stars spray across a moonless sky, the only visible light for as far as I can see. Wind whips across my face, and I hear splashing against the boat's sides. But even our wake is lost to darkness. I squint ahead, struggling to see the inky islands the helmsman so deftly swerves to avoid as we reach Madeira Bay in the Everglades. It feels like a maze to me, but the driver steers directly to our destination. I step to the bow as the boat slows, grabbing a line and switching on my headlamp as I hear sand scrape across the bottom. I'm about to jump into the shallows when I notice a glint of red glowing in the water. I turn and find an American crocodile gazing into my light. That should be Mom, my colleague observes. We watch in silence as the animal sinks out of view. Unlike its notorious counterparts in Africa and Australia, South Florida's crocodile is shy, this female unwilling even to defend her nest against our intrusion. I wait until the ripples calm, then ease into the knee-deep water. I tie our skiff to a mangrove root and follow a makeshift trail to a sandy mound above the high tide mark. The mound remains intact, eggs safely buried within, unharmed by floods or raccoons, but apparently not yet ready for Mom to free the hatchlings we'd hoped to find, mark, and measure. The numbers from this particular nest will be added another day, but the cumulative story from over a quarter century is a positive one. So, that's just to kind of give you an idea of what my goal was with Wild Florida. But, of course, the further you go into the Keys, the more and more tropical it feels. And by the time you get to Dry Tortugas National Park, which is about 70 miles west of Key West, and about 70 miles north of Havana, you're in the Caribbean. Like, truly, you're in the Caribbean. You have manatees, you have crocodiles, you have sapphire waters, you have white sand beaches, but in addition, you have several species of tropical birds that nest nowhere else in the continental United States. What you see up there by the fort are masked boobies, and what you see down below are sooty terns. And believe it or not, Dry Tortuga National Park became a park not because of the fort, but because of the really large breeding colony of tropical sooty terns that were there. And it's still one of the largest breeding colonies anywhere. And Dry Tortugas is also famous as a bird migration destination, especially in spring. If you've ever been there in a fallout, like the weather is combined and all of the birds are kind of blown onto the island, it is incredible because it's a tiny little island, they have nowhere to go, they're exhausted, and they're literally just sitting there, like tons of different species all together in a very small space. So it is one of the most amazing places to go during spring migration if you hit it right. But as you can see on that migration map, Florida is on several flyways. So in fact, all of Florida is fair game during migration season. And the general trend is that in the fall, the birds come down the east coast, and in the spring, the birds come up the west coast. So guess what? You guys have the better deal. Because in the spring is when the birds are all prettied up to try and attract mates. So you definitely have the better end of that deal. But the other thing that's very cool about Florida is our year-long resident birds, many of these wading birds that are so big, they're so calm, they're so easy to see, they don't even mind if you're right there where they're nesting. And that's one of the things that really makes Florida spectacular, is we have so many species of wading birds that are so easy to see. And while I would like to just celebrate natives, I wanted these books also to be an accurate representation of Florida today. And Florida today is both a national and a global leader in non-native species. In fact, sometimes what we see most often is the non-native species, not the native. So this is the Cuban anole, rather than our green anole. Some people don't even know the green anole, which is the native one, exists. And in fact, in today's day and age, we have more species of non-native lizards established in Florida than we have native species of lizards in Florida. And same thing with birds, right? I mean, not that we have more of them, but we do have a lot of them. And as a birder, I will say it's pretty exciting to go out and see parrots and parakeets and macaws. One day I woke up and I had macaws in the tree in front of my bedroom, right? So that's pretty exciting. But nonetheless, there are some downsides to non-native species, and the python is really kind of one of the big examples of that right now. This actually, I knew I had to include a python, and fortunately I was the artist in residence at Big Cypress National Preserve, and I got to go out with their research team. And they were looking at a new method to try and capture pythons out in remote areas, because most of our efforts at the moment are concentrated along streets and high ground. But in fact, some of the most destruction is happening out in the wetlands. And so what you have there at the top, at the time she was a record-breaking female. I think they've caught one bigger now. But they had her in a box with holes drilled into the side so that her pheromones, or her perfumes essentially, could get out into the atmosphere. And then what they were doing is they were monitoring it closely and capturing any male that they found. And the idea was, well, can we put a female out somewhere to act as bait to collect a whole bunch of males and take them out? So this time they were just radio tracking them. And so that's in fact what we were doing. We were radio tracking, and they were showing this project to a senator's office. So we had about 20 people with us. We could hear the radio track was working. We could hear it beeping, like, you're really close, you're really close, you're really close. But we walked around for half an hour before finally somebody said, wait, is that a snake? This thing had his head down. He was coiled at the base of a cypress tree underwater. And he'd been that way for half an hour. He stayed that way for half an hour longer as we talked about him. And then everybody left, and the only reason I got this picture is because I waited for another 20 minutes before he finally put his nose up just for a quick breath and went back down. This is a very significant enemy, and very hard to find, obviously. I mean, I had heard this. I have friends that have been radio tracking them in the Everglades, so I knew it could be challenging, but I had no idea it could be as challenging as I experienced there. But the reason they are so effective is because, in fact, they've been living in tropical wetlands for millennia in Asia, right? Well, the Everglades is only 10,000 years old. So guess what? Most of our species that are trying to live in the Everglades are from the temperate zone. We have deer and bobcats, and they're learning how to live in the Everglades. These guys know how to do it much better. So that's been part of the dilemma, and I think they're probably here to stay. That's the reality. We can manage all we want. But the good news is some of our native wildlife is finally starting to figure out what to do with them. And so there have been some recent cases of bobcats fighting python mothers and raiding the nest to eat the eggs. So hopefully we'll start to have a little bit of a more balanced population anyway as our wildlife starts to figure out how to deal with this crazy predator. But I also want to make it clear that not all non-native species are completely destructive. This is a population of vervet monkeys that escaped a facility near the Fort Lauderdale airport decades ago. And they've been living there ever since, probably with minimal localized effect in the mangrove right there, and I don't know, maybe to some of the cars as well. But the beauty of Florida and what makes it so special and so unique is that we are blended. There is nowhere in the state that you can say, oh, it's all tropical here, or it's all temperate there, right? The way I describe it in wild Florida is it's like a temperate tropical quilt that's been laid across the panhandle. So you can go to Blue Spring State Park in the middle of the state, and you can see manatees fill the waters on a cold winter morning. And that same night, you can go out and see temperate fireflies fill the skies. Or you can go to tropical Everglades National Park, and if you're lucky, you can find the elusive mangrove cuckoo. Actually, you guys are lucky. Sometimes they show up here in the refuge too, so you might even see them closer to home. But down in Everglades, you can also see the eastern towhee, which is a temperate species. And even our monarchs show two different lifestyles. These guys are up in St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge by the historic lighthouse. They're part of the great North American migration, and they're getting ready to cross the Gulf to overwinter in Mexico. Well, guess what? In my yard, I have monarchs all year round. They do not migrate. They stay there. And throughout history, there have been little pockets of monarchs in the Caribbean that don't migrate. So there's two different lifestyles, even for monarchs. And what has allowed Florida to hold all of this biodiversity is our amazing network of reserves. Historically, Florida has done really well. Places like Ding Darling have been established. And so about 30% of our land is in protection. And so those little colored boxes are the reserves of different types. Some of them federal, some of them state, some of them local. But if you look, there's some gaps in there, right? And I can tell you after years of driving up and down the state that some of those gaps are really, really large, especially if you look at it from the perspective of a little animal just come out of the forest, wanting to cross the road to the next patch of forest, and it's looking at lots of tires in between. So even a single road can be a problem. And if you think about it from a perspective of a large animal like the Florida panther, we really need to do better. We really need to create connections with natural areas, even if it's just a thin corridor, all the way across the state so that we can support our wildlife. And initially when the panthers were about to go extinct and they were going to all this effort to bring them back, they protected a bunch of land in Southwest Florida. And that's been great. It has helped them. However, their population's coming back. That's the good news. The bad news is there wasn't enough land protected from them at the time. So now they're trying to migrate into Central Florida, and roads are the single biggest source of mortality for them. So we really do need to create those corridors, and we do need to maintain the reserves that are already present, because some of our species, like the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, only occur within a single park at this point. This guy would be non-existent if it weren't for Everglades National Park. And also, of course, that means ecological health for us, and that's really important because we're ground zero for climate change. And this is a species that really demonstrates the importance of having these different reserves and the resiliency that that provides. Historically, roseate spoonbills only nested in Florida Bay, within the Everglades. And Audubon, Florida has been monitoring their populations for decades, and they got a little concerned a while back because they were realizing all the nests were suddenly dying. Chicks were dying left and right, none of the nests were succeeding. They were like, oh my gosh, the roseate spoonbill is about to plummet. We're gonna go through an extinction event. The good news is that didn't happen. The reason that didn't happen, and the reason they couldn't feed their young, was because saltwater intrusion had changed the composition of the fish, and they could no longer capture the fish they needed for their young. But the roseate spoonbills were clever enough to see that, the adults. They said, no, this is not working. Our babies are all dying. So they moved. And they could do that because there are reserves in other parts of the state that protect similar habitat. And so, in fact, this picture was from St. Augustine, and their population is doing just fine, thank you very much. But really, the hope for Florida's future is coexistence. Learning to live with nature. And for me, bears ended up being the best example of that. I early on knew I needed pictures of bears for this book, Wild Florida. And so the second I got my book contract, I went up to Ocala National Forest, because that's where everybody said, go to Ocala National Forest, you'll get your pictures, no problem. And I was so excited because they set up my tent, and the camp host came over and said, hey, you might want to move your tent, because there's a mother bear and her cub coming through here every day. And I went, perfect. I'm exactly where I want to be. This is awesome. Well, unfortunately, word had gotten out that I was there, and I wanted to see them because they didn't show up. And for the next 2 years, the bears gave me the cold shoulder. That picture there, I'm in my camo, I've got no scent because I learned at that point that they could smell really well. And I was like, oh, they smell me, okay. So I got this thing that was supposed to cover my scent and smell like soil, but it didn't smell like soil. It was the most disgusting chemical smell I've ever smelled. But hopefully it didn't smell like me anyway. So I sat in this spot all day long. It's where I had seen for days on end, every morning, every night, reliably, fresh bear tracks. And I was like, I'm gonna get it today. The bear tracks showed up. In the 10 minutes I went into the woods to pee. Meanwhile, I met somebody outside of Naples in the Golden Gates area, and she said, you know, I have bears in my yard once a week or so why don't you come stay with me for a while and get pictures? So I've been to her house a few times too, and I'd stay for 10 days, and the bears would come on day 11. It was really starting to take it personally. So I had 1 month to my deadline for Wild Florida, and I did not have bear pictures. And so I called this woman up and I said, I'm so sorry, but would it be okay for me to camp out on your porch for the next month? Because I have to have these pictures. And she was very generous. She said, no, you can't stay on my porch, but you can have a bedroom. So yeah, come on, come down. So I went to her house. 10 days passed, no bears. I'm like, okay, we're in trouble. Somebody else in the neighborhood heard I was there and what I was trying to do, and so he called me and he said, hey, I get bears in my yard every day. Why don't you come to my yard? I was like, okay. So he generously let me drive my Jeep into his backyard and do my little blind thing, roll down the windows and sit there. And the first evening I sat there and I sat there and I sat there and I watched all the turkeys go to roost. It's getting dark, I can't see anything. I'm about to turn the key in the ignition when all of a sudden a bear comes out. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is so exciting. Totally dark. I took 100 pictures. Of course, none of them were usable because it was too dark, but I was so worried. What if this is my only bear, right? But next morning, bright and early, before the sunrise, I went in his backyard. As soon as the sun came up, wham, bam, thank you, man, there are bears having sex right outside the window of my Jeep. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm like shaking from adrenaline because it's crazy. Then another bear comes by, then another bear comes by, and then I get a phone call from the woman who I've been staying with. She's like, there's a big mom bear coming to my yard, come to my house. So I go running driving across town to her yard, and I get pictures of that mama. And I managed to have them in my book while I submitted it, but it was going to review, so I knew I would have time to switch some pictures out during the revision. And so she said, come to my yard, I have bear cubs. And I think this was a different mom, but nonetheless, I got to watch an entire cycle of bear life play out in people's yards. If people can learn to live with a big predator like the Florida bear, we can do this. We can totally do this. We just need to learn how. And while not all of us are lucky enough to host a bear in our yard, we can host things like birds. This was actually in my yard. This is a migrating eastern kingbird in a lignum vitae that I had just planted a few months earlier. And to me this was significant because this is what that yard looked like when I first moved in. Okay, it's not just rocks. Underneath those rocks was a thick layer of plastic because, you know, we wouldn't want any illicit plants growing, right? And then, of course, all kinds of decking, and then the only places where there were plants, and by the way, they were planted in plastic with little holes for the individual plants, are what I like to call Home Depot specials. They're really pretty, right? The reason they're really pretty, nobody eats them. They are food deserts for wildlife. They don't provide anything for wildlife. They're not from Florida, and nothing eats them. And that's why they manage to look like plastic, no matter what, right? So at this point when we moved in, we had one single cardinal. That was it, nothing else. And we were like, okay, we wrote a gardening book on how to garden for wildlife. This is just not gonna work. So this may have been extreme, but we did bring in a bulldozer and we took it all out. And as you can see here, we tried to go back to what was natural for the area. We live on a limestone ridge, so we put up, and we found actually we have a historic 1920s cottage on our property, and we discovered the old 1920s rock wall that went with it. So we reestablished that, got rid of the white picket fence. Now it's got native ferns growing all over it. We put native plants everywhere. We didn't have space for a lawn, but we did want to create a diverse lawn because it emulates a meadow, a Florida meadow, if you put diverse plants in there rather than just St. Augustine grass, right? So we did that around the pool. And we're not purists. We like to grow food too, so we've got grapes and some other things in there as well. But now we have over 100 species of birds and other insects and mammals and reptiles that are living there. I've actually introduced all the different species of freshwater turtles into our ponds. And I can tell you, actually, that pond, as soon as we built it and filled it with water, even before we put anything in there, we had a cloud of dragonflies in the yard. And there are times during the year where literally you have to dodge the butterflies to get through our yard because there's so many of them. So this is a small property, but it is an ecological contribution. And if more people did this in their yards, or even if they just have a patio, put it on the potted plants outside. You don't have to have a lot of space. If everybody's putting 1 or 2 native plants out, we can also build wildlife corridors within the urban area. And that is a large part of what's going to be helpful for Florida moving forward, because we're not going to have no development. We're not going to have new people not moving here, right? So we need to learn how to bring nature back into our lives. And I can tell you, it's just not just an ecological contribution, but it can be an emotional one. So shortly after we had redone our yard, I was walking to my yoga class. I live in Coconut Grove along Main Highway, which, as the name might suggest, is a little bit of a busy road. But it's also, lots of big oaks, and it's quite shaded and beautiful. And I'm walking to class, and I look up and I see these little yellow eyes and some sort of a contortionist animal up in the tree, and I don't even know what I'm looking at because it's moving around so much. Suddenly those eyes lock into mine, and a baby owl ends up at my feet. And I'm like, oh my. Okay, now I feel responsible for you. And it was that little baby screech owl. And obviously I knew I needed to give it back to the parents. So I looked for a nest, and I couldn't find one. It was this massive tree. So I finally found a little hollow that was kind of tucked away from all the traffic, and went to my yoga class, but I just couldn't relax in Shavasana because I was a little worried about this baby. So on my way back, I stop and I look in the hole, and at first I get really excited because he's not there anymore. I'm like, yes, great. But then I look down and he's at my feet again, and this time his eyes are not open. He's clearly dehydrated, and he's not going to make it if I leave him there. So I wrap him in my towel, I take him to the closest rehabilitation center, and after he passed his mouse catching test, which is a real thing, they brought him back to my yard as an adult, that little guy there, and they put him in one of my owl boxes. He's been living in my yard ever since. He's not in the owl box anymore, he's moved into the trees, but he is there every year reliably. And I can tell you, it makes me feel really good, not just in an abstract, oh, I've helped with ecology, but like, I helped you. You're alive because of me. You have a home because of me. We're neighbors. And it feels really, really incredibly gratifying. So it can also be a very humane and exciting thing to do, not just an abstract, I've helped with the environment kind of thing. What I'd like to do now is just end with a little bit of a reading at the very end of my Wild Florida book, which is my hopes and dreams for Florida. And the section where I'm talking about knowing what it's like to not have any nature, that refers back to that time when I was living in Manila, when I was little. I've experienced firsthand what life is like without nature, and it's not pleasant. We rely on natural areas and wild animals for any number of ecological services, but also, as I discovered at 10, our own overall well-being. My grandmother wasn't a particularly nature-loving woman, but in her final years, confined to a shared room in a nursing home, one of the things that brought her pleasure was a bird feeder that flitted with life just outside her window. Fortunately, as I hope this book helps reveal, Florida still has a lot of animal life. From manatees wallowing in clear springs to roseate spoonbills nesting in mangroves, walking stick insects atop pitcher plants in a seepage bog, and gopher tortoises burrowing in open pine forest. Nature is Florida's heart and soul. With a little foresight and strategic planning, people can continue flocking to Florida to walk its beaches, snorkel its reefs, fish its waters, kayak its springs, and view its unique array of animals for many generations to come. It is my enduring hope that Florida will always have its wild.